Poppy Playtime Chapter 4 was full of lore drops, by far the most lore-dense chapter in the entire series. I mean, just look at the note count compared to every other chapter. But one of the most insane lore drops in the game was the full confirmation that Poppy is Elliot Ludwig's late daughter. Or at least whoever was turned into this particular Poppy doll is Elliot Ludwig's late daughter. But if she's Elliot's daughter, is the prototype Elliot Ludwig? If so, what's his grand plan? What's actually going to happen in Chapter 5? Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. Now, I'm not going to go over the entire story of Poppy Playtime. You can watch this video if you want my timeline. And I'm not going to go over everything that happened in Chapter 4. You can watch this video if you want to see that. But I will go over important information for today's theory, just so you know the characters and concepts we're working with. So, incredibly brief refresher. Playtime Co. was originally founded by Elliot Ludwig. His only daughter died in the 1960s, and he himself died sometime in the late 80s. The prototype is the main villain of this game. Since it's described as the first successful experiment of its kind, we can assume that it's a human that's been turned into a toy. We've only been able to see this arm and these legs, but it is capable of mimicking human speech. And it's incredibly intelligent. Poppy is another human-turned toy, but we have much less information on her experimentation. We're not sure when she was made, why she was made, or why she was kept in a glass case. Some other side characters you might need to know: Dr. Harley Sawyer is the main brain behind the Bigger Bodies Initiative, the program to turn people into toys. And some of the executives at the facility who are behind this are Leith Pierre and Eddie Warrenbach, later adding Stella Graber. Those are the characters you'll need to know for today's theory. And it's also worth pointing out that the prototype was seen as an ideal outcome for these experiments because it didn't need any sustenance to survive. A lot, if not all of the toys needed to eat and sleep, but the prototype didn't need either. We can presume that Poppy is the same way. After all, she was kept in a glass case for an unknown amount of time, which she survived, and the prototype puts emphasis that he and Poppy are one and the same. But those are just the characters. We need to know some more context as to what's happened in the story so far, specifically the games themselves and what's gone on, not just the background lore. We, the player, are a former employee at Playtime Co., who received a letter that employees were still surviving but trapped at the factory, and we went to investigate. Although in Chapter 4, the Doctor alludes that this can't be our only motivation, that we're likely here for another reason that we don't know yet. Upon arrival, we find Poppy is trapped in a clear case, and we let her out. She tells us that the prototype is making things horrible in this factory and needs to be stopped. He's essentially the one behind all of this. As we play throughout the games, and especially the end of Chapter 3 and all of Chapter 4, we learn that the prototype and Poppy work together to start the Hour of Joy, a rebellion where all of the toys at once killed every employee they could and brought the children down into the labs. But there's a major gap here that we don't know, and that major gap is pretty much everything from after the Hour of Joy to before we get there. We just know that it's been very bad ever since, that now the prototype is still holding those orphans in the lab in some kind of stasis, and the Doctor has been helping him to continue the experiments the scientists were working on. In the meanwhile, the toys that are still at the factory are starving and trying to survive, turning to eating each other to stay alive. We end Chapter 4 with this cutscene, where Ollie reveals he's been the prototype this whole time, or at least for a very long time, leading Poppy along and getting us to do exactly what he wanted.
What did you do with Ollie?
I'm right here, Poppy. For you. I'll always be here.
He mentions her time in the case.
I admit, though, I'm disappointed. After all that time in your case, I'd hoped you'd see things differently.
And even she brings it up.
I can't go back in the case. I can't.
And that's where the game leaves us, just outside the labs, hopefully able to figure out what's actually going on here in Chapter 5. But lucky for you, you don't have to wait that long, because I'm here to provide. So what is actually going on here? To figure out what the prototype is truly after, we need to know who the prototype is, because the only thing we know about the goals of the prototype are from this VHS tape between the prototype and the Doctor. He argues with the Doctor, mentioning that they're on a time crunch, but the Doctor mentions that the exact thing the prototype is working for is what the scientists before were trying to crack for so many years, and it's not that simple. But here's the thing, what he's trying to do isn't turn people into toys. Sure, they weren't perfect conversions, and a lot of their mental states were horrible after the conversion, but clearly there were successful experiments, so the scientists had figured that out. Throughout Chapter 4, we get more and more information that turning people into toys wasn't the end goal for what Playtime Co. was planning. Frankly, the Bigger Bodies Initiative that Dr. Harley Sawyer started seems like an addendum, something to do in the meanwhile to help progress their main cause. And whatever that main main cause is, the prototype is trying to solve it. So who is the prototype? Well, one of the prevailing theories for a long time was that the prototype is Elliot Ludwig. After all, Elliot Ludwig and everything we know about him points to him being genuinely a good guy who cares for the children at the facility, and children in general. So the idea that he would be against turning children into toys is pretty solid. And in Chapter 4, we get tapes showing that the executives are more than willing to silence anyone who gets in their way. Dr. Harley Sawyer was essentially turned into Siri for not staying in line. And if they're willing to do that to the main brain behind this operation, who's to say they're not willing to do it to Elliot, who wouldn't even let them use the children in this scenario? But if that's true, and he was turned into the prototype because he's too altruistic and refuses to sacrifice children, why is he so cruel now? As the prototype is incredibly violent and willing and able to kill anyone who gets in his way without a moment's hesitation. And he's been starving and experimenting on the toys ever since the Hour of Joy. And these toys are just children who were made into toys. So this was the main issue with this theory. And interestingly, Chapter 4 came along and gave us evidence for and against this theory. On one hand, when Poppy and the prototype fully meet and talk, the prototype talks to Poppy as if she's his daughter.
It's time to come home.
Poppy.
It's time to come home.
He speaks to her like a disappointed father. Sure, it's twisted and manipulative and threatening, but lines like, "We are the same," and "It's time to come home" sound familial, especially pointing out that they're one and the same. However, on the other hand, if you get this red tape, which is impossibly hard to get on a first playthrough, Poppy doesn't talk about the prototype like a father. Quite the opposite. She talks about how frustrated she is with the prototype after the Hour of Joy.
Prototype says we can't leave. Not now. Not ever. I hate him. I hate him, and I hate this place, and I hate that he's... right.
And then, almost immediately after, she says this.
I wish you were here, Dad. I could really use one of your talks right about now. You know what to say.
If the prototype truly is Elliot Ludwig, then her dad still is here. She just did talk to him. The fact that she differentiates those makes it seem unlikely that he is Elliot Ludwig. But to be fair, both of these points of evidence are easily disputed. The first point is more vibes than evidence anyway, and the second point could be explained by her not knowing that the prototype is Elliot Ludwig, not remembering, or refusing to see the prototype as her father since his personality has shifted so much. All of these are possible. Not to mention, it seems like there was a period of time after the Hour of Joy where Poppy and the prototype were working together, or at least spending time together before the case, as the prototype seems to be the one who put her in the case in the first place. But that's kind of where the theory stood. We didn't have strong evidence either way, so we just had these ideas. But then I got an email for the Freddy Fazbear Pizza podcast.
Where am I? Where did you take me? What do you want from me? You want me to read this? GAMERSUPPS, a leader in powdered drinks, teas, and soups for gamers, has a special offer just for you. You could have always used creator codes such as RYTOAST for 10% off, but for this week only, February 21st to the 28th, creator codes will get you 21% off your entire order. That's technically more than double the discount just for you. So make sure to use code RYTOAST for a massive deal this week. GAMERSUPPS drinks are sugar-free, keto-friendly, and come in caffeine and non-caffeine variety. Not to mention their AFK line of magnesium-focused drinks to aid sleep that come with or without melatonin. It just says to talk about my favorite flavor. I mean, I really like the chunk juice flavor. That's lemon lime mixed berry combination. Thanks again for the continued partnership with GAMERSUPPS. Can I leave now?
For those of you who don't know, for the podcast on this YouTube channel, I take questions via email. And recently, I got one from Eepy Soldier, a longtime community member and livestream chatter. By the way, I livestream 4 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday at 9 p.m. EST on the second channel and on Twitch at RyToastYT. I would love to see you there. Anyway, Eepy Soldier sent me an email about Poppy Playtime, and it was very interesting. I even answered it on the podcast. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to think of other pieces of evidence that could point to it. So let me just read you Eepy Soldier's email verbatim. So while I'm not fully a supporter of the Elliot is the prototype theory, I do think it raises a particularly interesting motivation for the prototype. We know now that Poppy is his daughter, so I propose that the prototype is trying to make a vessel, not for himself, but for her. A few things struck me as odd about chapter 4, quote, "I've got something special in mind, I prepared it just for you, and this one you'll never want to leave," quote, "from the prototype to Poppy." And I forgot the exact quote, but the doctor mentions the note. This raises a few questions for me. Why does the doctor know about the note? And why does the prototype highlight the connection between it and Poppy? What if the reason the prototype put Poppy in that box initially was to keep her safe until her vessel was ready? That's why, despite his opportunities to kill us and her, he doesn't. Why else make that dramatic reveal if not to split us up into his final plan prep? And then about the note. The doctor knowing about it implies the prototype knows about it. I think the prototype sent it, but why direct us to his enemy, Poppy? If not to have us bring her down so he can use us as her vessel. He doesn't mention this because we know, but the note is the letter we received at the very beginning of the game telling us to find the flower. And of course, in the flower is the Poppy doll. But this email brings a whole new perspective to the prototype being Elliot Ludwig. Throughout chapter 4, they kept teasing the idea that the Bigger Bodies initiative wasn't the main plan of Playtime Co. Turning people into toys wasn't the end goal. There was a bigger goal that the scientists at Playtime Co. were working to achieve, and the Bigger Bodies initiative was just something they did with it. That major goal is what the prototype has been working on still. I've been saying for a while that the prototype seems to be guiding us down here. It easily could have killed us at the end of chapter 2 or chapter 3, but it didn't, letting us live and just taking a body. This plan to keep Poppy preserved and then put Poppy into a new vessel could have been the plan all along. But I hear you. This goes back to our original issue. Would Elliot Ludwig do this? Cause all of this suffering just for that? Would he really try to turn people into toys just to turn them back into people again? No, he wouldn't. But that's why I think he is the prototype. And it all comes down to experiment 814. I went back looking through all the experiment logs to try to get any more information on the actual process of turning people into toys. And one stuck out to me as interesting. Experiment 814, the only one we have before the 1000 series. It's the handwritten note we find on Elliot Ludwig's desk. And the fact that it's handwritten on his desk and seems to be from an earlier time before they had a printed out page for the experiment logs, many people believe this experiment to be before the Bigger Bodies initiative, done by Elliot Ludwig, and I think that's incredibly likely, if not basically confirmed. But let me read through this experiment log. Notes: this experiment utilized a live rat. Rat was fed 3 portions daily for 2 weeks. At the end of the 2 weeks, the rat was killed and submerged into a poppy flower and preservative gel mixture. 1 week later, an electric shock was applied to the rat, still in the gel, in an attempt to revive it. The rat remained unresponsive. Analysis: I still believe in the potential of the poppy flower. Its unusual properties lead me to believe that the proper mixture and procedure could have life-altering properties. The poppy flower has, for a long time, carried heavy symbolism, and I don't believe that's for no reason. Perhaps something larger than a rat would yield different results. At first, this note led a lot of people to believe that maybe Elliot Ludwig wasn't so innocent after all. Maybe he had a hand in all of these experiments of turning people into toys. But look again at this note. Not once does it mention a toy. The main goal of this experiment is to bring something dead back to life. The only goal of this plan was resurrection. And that's our key here. That is the thing that makes all of this make sense. It explains the driving force behind Elliot Ludwig, the motivations for all of these experiments, the thing that's so tantalizing that even Stella, someone who loves the children, is willing to forsake them to achieve. And it explains what the prototype is doing now. So let me tell you the full story of Elliot Ludwig. And I want to be clear, I'm gonna say things as if it sounds like justifications. This is from Elliot's point of view. So this is what he thinks is justifiable. None of what happens is justifiable. Elliot Ludwig's daughter fell ill in the 1960s and died, and his life goal was no longer making toys for children to make them smile, instead solely focusing on bringing her back. He had her body preserved, and spent the rest of his life studying feverishly into poppy flowers to try and resurrect her. His experiments were ultimately unsuccessful, but he kept doing it, working on rats and larger creatures until eventually he felt certain that he found something. A way to maybe not revive her, but at least transfer a consciousness into something else. And that's when he had his first successful experiment, putting her mind and soul into the Poppy doll. He didn't bring her back to life, but he at least preserved her consciousness and personality. If he could figure out that secret to life, she'd be there, ready to be brought back and be his daughter again. He made her a space in the factory to live, and hoped that one day they could leave together as a family. He kept working on these experiments, but over the years, Laith Pierre, a fellow executive, saw what he was trying to accomplish, and realized he's been wasting too much time over his precious morality. They had an on-site orphanage at this Playcare factory, and Laith urged Elliot to just use the ample, untraceable test subjects in that orphanage. At any moment, he could have a child with no one to check in on them, and use them as a living test subject. Surely that would speed up the experimentation process, and surely that would unlock this secret to life. But Elliot was unwilling to do that. He always refused, noting that those children were innocent, and his goal was to help people. In Elliot's own words, progress can never be put over people. But Laith saw Elliot as short-sighted and naive. So Laith Pierre and the rest of the executives hired a private investigator to find Dr. Harley Sawyer, someone Elliot admitted was smarter than he was, but had less of a moral high standing. When Harley Sawyer arrived to the Playcare, he suggested the Bigger Bodies Initiative. He could solve all of their problems. If they just turned people into large toys instead of trying to resurrect them, they could learn more about the aspects of what makes someone alive, and have free labor for the factory. But Elliot Ludwig still refused. From the executive's point of view, he still wouldn't see the bigger picture here. In this biological experimentation, surely they would learn more about what makes someone living. But Elliot Ludwig stood in the way. When Harley Sawyer, the heart of this operation, refused to stay in line, the executives turned him into a glorified computer, preserving his mind but disabling his free will, having another human doctor take his place. Who's to say they weren't willing to do the same to Elliot Ludwig, even making him patient number 0? They had everything they could have ever needed. Decades of Elliot Ludwig's research, thousands of untraceable test subjects, the brain of one of the smartest and least moral scientists they know, and a massive facility all to their own. Elliot Ludwig was the only obstacle between them and eternal life, so that's the only thing they had to get rid of. As the prototype, Elliot kept his personality and intelligence, but he lost a bit of his morality, willing to kill any employee in a second to get out. But part of him remained in there, that part that cared for the children, so deeply that after tricking a child to help get him set free, he turned himself in, giving up his freedom because in the process that child was wounded and would have died otherwise. At the end of the day, those children are still innocent, but the employees are anything but. He reached out to Poppy, someone he knew was just as intelligent as him, and just as resentful to the current heads of the factory, but someone he didn't want to reveal himself to. If Poppy knew that her father had been turned into this, she might fall apart. She might lose hope. He would have to save her without her even knowing who he is. So as the prototype, he approaches Poppy, and together they plan the Hour of Joy, getting rid of all employees and adults who would be in the way, the ones who did such horrible things to the children and themselves. And Elliot brought the children to the labs where they could be kept in a safe stasis. He wanted to free them, wants to let them see the light of day, but he knows that if thousands of orphans pile out of this factory, questions will be asked. And if the factory gets investigated before he's able to save his daughter, then all of this would be for nothing. They would go from one testing chamber to another, never truly being free, and never being human again. It pained him to do so, but those orphans had to stay in the factory until his research was complete, until he knew how to turn Poppy back into a human, how to undo the limits on life. And that's what he's done for the past 10 years, forced the doctor to send him the toys in the factory. It's regrettable that they were once children, but they're lost now. Many of them are barely sentient. He can try to bring them back, try to turn them back to humans, but he's failed ever since, using them as merely test subjects. But then he has an idea. Like his rat experiments, maybe the effects will be better on a larger body. So he sends a letter out to one of the few employees who wasn't there on the day of the Hour of Joy, someone who's survived. He beckons us to the factory to find Poppy and bring her down, all in the hope that Poppy and the player end up in those labs. He might not be able to turn Poppy into a human again, but if he was able to put Poppy's consciousness and spirit into a toy, who's to say he can't move it into our body? After all, we're just another employee. Someone who in his eyes deserves to die. If anything, giving our body to Poppy would be the least we could do. Shout out again to Eepy Soldier for the idea that the vessel that the prototype is creating isn't for himself, but for Poppy. It makes so much sense when it's laid out like this. But I will say, I think it's equally likely with the evidence we have that the prototype is actually who Ollie was. Ollie was turned into the prototype. I think it's incredibly possible that the executives just killed Elliot Ludwig, used a boy to turn into the prototype, and left his body parts at Elliot's estate to smear his image. Yes, I think that bag of body parts is who Ollie once was, and turned into the prototype. That's super possible as well. I think it's really one of those two options. But who do you think is the prototype? Let me know in the comments below. And in the meantime, if you want a FNAF theory, last week I went into how Help Wanted 2 tells us more about Vanny, Glitch Trap, and Dr. Rabbit, a character you might not know if you haven't been paying attention to my recent theories, or reading the books. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share it with hashtag ToastArt. A huge thank you to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.